They say that at my age you're supposed to be looking back on a life well lived with a sense of quiet satisfaction. I'm 68 years old, a retired judge who spent 4 decades presiding over the chaos of other people's lives, searching for the truth in a sea of lies. I thought I knew what a man's legacy was supposed to look like. I thought mine was etched in the marble of the Virginia courthouse and reflected in the polished mahogany of my dining room table. On the night of my 40th wedding anniversary, the air in our Richmond estate was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive bourbon. I looked at Eleanor, my wife, Suzy, standing under the crystal chandelier, and I saw the personification of everything I had fought for. But as the music played, and our son Julian raised his glass for a toast, a single vibration in my breast pocket changed the trajectory of my existence. It wasn't just a phone call. It was a ghost from my past, reaching through the veil of my comfortable reality to tell me that my life was a beautifully constructed fraud. In that one moment, the warmth of the room turned to ice, and the faces of the people I loved most became the masks of strangers. I realized that the hardest judgment I would ever have to pass wasn't in a courtroom, but in the silence of my own home against the people who shared my name. Before we continue with this intense journey, after you have liked and commented to support the channel, I want to send my sincerest wishes for health and happiness to all the elders and friends listening today. I'm curious to know, how old are you? Which city are you joining from? And what time is it there right now? Your presence is the greatest motivation for me to continue telling Arthur's story. Let's move forward. The ballroom was a sea of familiar faces, all of them smiling with a kind of practiced reverence that comes with being associated with a man of my standing. I had spent 40 years as Arthur Sterling, the judge who was as unyielding as the law itself. Tonight, however, I wasn't the man in the black robe. I was just a husband celebrating 4 decades of what I believed was a perfect union. Eleanor looked breathtaking. She wore a deep emerald silk gown that matched the color of the Virginia hills in spring, her silver hair styled in a way that commanded respect without demanding it. Beside her stood Julian, our eldest, looking every bit the successful businessman I had raised him to be. He was deep in conversation with a group of investors, his gestures fluid and confident. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The catering staff moved like shadows, refilling glasses of vintage Cabernet, while the string quartet in the corner played a soft, haunting melody that seemed to weave through the laughter and the clinking of silverware. I felt a quiet pride as I looked around the room. We had built an empire of respectability. But then, my phone buzzed in my tuxedo pocket. It was a private, encrypted line, one I hadn't used since my days working closely with federal task forces. I frowned, stepping toward the heavy velvet curtains near the French doors to get a moment of privacy. The caller ID showed a string of zeros, a digital signature I recognized instantly. It was Silas. Silas was a man who lived in the margins of the intelligence community, an old friend who had retired years ago but still kept his ear to the ground. We hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. Arthur, his voice came through, sounding like gravel being ground under a boot. It was low, urgent, and devoid of the usual pleasantries. Silas? It's been a long time. Now isn't exactly the best. Listen to me very carefully, he interrupted, his tone chilling the blood in my veins. I don't have much time, and neither do you. We've been tracking a series of offshore movements linked to a domestic shell company. It's dirty, Arthur. Deeply dirty. And the primary signatory on the latest transfer isn't a criminal you've sentenced. It's Eleanor. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my soul. That's impossible, Silas. You've got the wrong name. Eleanor is a philanthropist. Arthur. Stop, he snapped. I'm looking at the ledger right now. It's tied to a project called Phoenix. They've used your judicial signatures, your stationery, your very reputation to clear paths for things I can't even describe over an open line. But that's not why I called tonight. They know we're closing in. They've decided to cut the anchor, Arthur. Do you understand what I'm saying? You are the anchor. I looked through the gap in the curtains. Julian was walking toward the head table, a bottle of champagne in his hand. He caught my eye and flashed a brilliant, white smile. The same smile he had used since he was a boy, to get whatever he wanted. Don't drink anything, Arthur, Silas whispered. Not the water, not the wine, and especially not the toast. They've already moved the funds. Your death is the final piece of the transfer. Leave the house now. The line went dead. I stood there, the heavy fabric of the curtain in my hand, feeling the world tilt on its axis. The laughter in the room suddenly sounded discordant, like a symphony played out of tune. I watched Julian reach the table where my glass sat, half filled with the expensive bourbon Eleanor had bought especially for tonight. I saw him lean down, his back partially to the crowd, and I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his hand over my glass. It was so quick, so practiced, that anyone else would have missed it. But I had spent 40 years watching the hands of guilty men in the witness stand. I knew what a sleight of hand looked like. "Dad, there you are," Julian called out, his voice booming with a warmth that now felt like a physical blow. "Come on, everyone is waiting. We can't start the tribute without the man of the hour." I forced my legs to move. My mind was racing, cycling through every law, every precedent, every memory of the last 40 years. Was it possible? Had I been so blinded by my own sense of righteousness that I had failed to see the rot in my own garden? I walked toward the table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Eleanor reached out and took my hand. Her skin was cool, her grip firm. "Are you all right, darling?" she asked, her eyes searching mine with a concern that I now realized was a calculated study. "You look a bit pale. Is it the excitement?" "I'm fine," I managed to say, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Just a bit of a headache. The music is a little loud tonight." Julian handed me the glass. The amber liquid shimmered under the lights, looking innocent, even inviting. "To 40 years of the sterling legacy," he said, raising his own glass. "To the man who taught me that the law is the only thing that matters, and to the woman who showed us that family is the only thing worth protecting." A chorus of "Here, here," rose from the guests. 100 glasses were raised in my direction. I looked at Julian, then at Eleanor. I saw the way they glanced at each other, a brief, flickering moment of shared understanding that bypassed me entirely. In that split second, the man I had been for 68 years died. The judge was gone. The husband was gone. What remained was a man who had been marked for execution in his own dining room. I raised the glass to my lips, the smell of oak and vanilla filling my nostrils. I let the rim touch my teeth, feeling the collective gaze of the room on me. I saw Julian's throat move as he swallowed his own drink, his eyes never leaving mine. He was waiting. They were both waiting for me to take the final sip of my life. "I'm sorry," I said suddenly, lowering the glass. I let out a sharp, forced cough, clutching my chest with my free hand. I made sure to let the glass wobble, a few drops of the liquid splashing onto the white linen tablecloth. I think I need my medication. Julian, help me to the study. Eleanor, please, apologize to the guests. I just need a moment of quiet." I saw the flash of irritation in Julian's eyes, a momentary break in the mask before he regained his composure. "Of course, Dad. Let me help you." He took my arm, his grip a little too tight, a little too urgent. As we walked away from the lights and the music, heading toward the quiet wing of the house where my library sat, I felt the weight of the flash drive in my other pocket, the one Silas had sent me months ago as a just-in-case that I had laughed off. I didn't have my medication in the study. I had a safe, a passport, and a legal pad filled with names I had never wanted to believe were real. I wasn't going to the study to rest. I was going there to begin a war. As we crossed the threshold of the hallway, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor in the mirror. She wasn't looking at me with worry. She was looking at the spilled bourbon on the tablecloth with a frown of pure, cold disappointment. That was the moment I knew. The woman I loved was gone, and in her place was a ghost I had to outrun before the night was over. I've spent 40 years of my life believing that the walls of my home were built of solid stone and unwavering loyalty. I thought that if the world outside ever became too loud or too cruel, I could retreat behind these oak doors and find sanctuary in the people who carried my name. But as Julian guided me down the long, carpeted hallway toward my study, his hand firm on my elbow, I realized that the sanctuary was a cage, and the architect of my imprisonment was my own flesh and blood. The air in the corridor felt thin, stripped of oxygen, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final act of a tragedy I had been too blind to see coming. Every family photo we passed the summer in Cape Cod, Julian's graduation from Yale, our Christmas by the fireplace, looked like a piece of evidence in a trial where I was both the victim and the judge who had allowed the crime to happen. My heart wasn't just racing. It was morning. It was the hollow ache of a man who realizes that the love he invested for 4 decades was nothing more than a currency used to buy his own destruction. I wasn't just walking toward my library. I was walking toward the end of Arthur Sterling, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to disappear into the shadows of my own life, the man I saw in the mirror would be dead before the candles on our anniversary cake had even flickered out. The hallway felt like a tunnel that kept stretching longer with every step I took. Julian didn't speak. He just kept that steady, forceful pace, his fingers digging slightly into the fabric of my tuxedo. I had taught him how to walk with that kind of purpose. I had taught him that a Sterling never wavers. Now, that very lesson was being used to escort me to what was supposed to be my final resting place. I could still hear the faint, muffled sound of the quartet playing La Vie en Rose back in the ballroom, a song Eleanor and I had danced to 1,000 times. It felt like a cruel joke, a soundtrack for a betrayal that was as elegant as it was lethal. "You're shaking, Dad," Julian said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real heat. It was the tone of a man observing a scientific phenomenon, not a son worried about his father's health. "We're almost there. Just a few more steps and you can sit down. You've worked too hard for too long. Maybe it's just time to let go of all that weight." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy calculating the distance to the side exit in the library, the one hidden behind the velvet drapes that led to the servants' stairs. I needed to get in there, lock the door, and get to the wall safe. If Silas was right, if the Phoenix Project was what he said it was, then the documents I had kept, the ones I thought were just boring administrative records of Eleanor's charitable foundation, were actually the blueprints of their crimes. When we reached the heavy mahogany doors of my study, Julian reached ahead and opened them for me. The room smelled of old leather, tobacco, and the thousands of law books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. It was my fortress, the place where I had made the most difficult decisions of my career. He led me to the wingback chair behind my desk and helped me sit. "I'll go get Mom," he whispered, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. For a second I saw the boy he used to be, the one I had taken fishing at the lake, but then his eyes shifted, becoming cold and glass-like. "Stay right here. Don't move, okay? You need to rest. Everything is going to be taken care of." He turned and walked out, closing the double doors with a soft, final click. I waited for exactly 5 seconds, counting the beats of my pulse, before I lunged for the desk. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely punch in the code for the safe hidden behind the portrait of my own father. My mind kept screaming, "Asterisk. He's your son. This can't be real. Silas is paranoid. Asterisk." But then I remembered the way Julian had looked at my glass. I remembered the disappointment on Eleanor's face when I didn't drink. The safe door swung open. I grabbed the leather-bound ledger and the small silver flash drive Silas had given me. I didn't have time to look through them. I stuffed them into the inner pocket of my coat, grabbed my backup set of car keys, and headed for the drapes. I didn't even turn off the desk lamp. I wanted them to think I was still there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the poison to take hold or for the accident to happen. I slipped through the side exit and down the narrow, dimly lit stairs. My knees ached with every step, a reminder of the 68 years I carried. But adrenaline was a powerful mask for pain. I reached the ground floor, slipping out through the mudroom door and into the biting chill of the Virginia night. I didn't head for the main garage where my Mercedes was parked. They'd be watching that. Instead, I ran toward the old gardener's shed near the edge of the woods, where I kept the beat-up 1998 Ford truck I used for hauling mulch and fishing gear. It was rusted, loud, and completely invisible to the high society world Eleanor lived in. I was halfway across the lawn when the world turned white. A roar, deeper and more violent than any thunder I had ever heard, ripped through the silence. The ground beneath my feet buckled, and a wave of heat slammed into my back, throwing me face first into the damp grass. I scrambled to turn around, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whistle that drowned out everything else. My library was gone. The entire east wing of the estate had been transformed into a pillar of orange and red fire. Shards of glass and charred fragments of my law books were raining down onto the manicured lawn like black snow. The explosion had been focused, professional, designed to collapse the floor of the study and incinerate everything inside, including me. I lay there in the shadows of the oak trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps, watching the house burn. And then I saw him. Julian stepped out onto the stone terrace, just 50 yards away from where the fire was hungrily licking the sky. He wasn't running for a fire extinguisher. He wasn't screaming for the servants. He stood perfectly still, the flickering light of the flames dancing across his face. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with a silver lighter I had given him for his 30th birthday, and took a long, slow drag. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, the neighbors must have called it in. Julian did something that broke the last piece of my heart. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief, or even of shock. It was the cold, satisfied smile of a man who had just successfully deleted a problem. He looked directly toward the burning remains of my desk, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and turned back toward the ballroom to comfort the grieving guests. I realized then that if I stood up, if I yelled, if I tried to reclaim my life, I would be dead before the fire department arrived. To the world, Judge Arthur Sterling was now ash and bone. My wife was a widow, my son was the heir, and the Sterling legacy was a funeral pyre. I crawled through the brush, my tuxedo torn and covered in dirt, until I reached the rusted Ford. I climbed inside, the smell of old bait and damp earth filling the cab. I didn't turn on the headlights. I backed the truck out of the shed and onto the narrow dirt path that led to the back of the property, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The glow of the fire followed me for miles, a red stain on the horizon that refused to fade. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I was a dead man driving a ghost of a truck, heading into a darkness I didn't understand, hunted by the people I had spent my life trying to protect. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold metal of the flash drive. It was all I had left of 40 years of living. I turned onto the main highway, heading west away from the city, away from the life I had known. My son's smile was burned into my retinas, more vivid than the fire itself. I didn't know where I was going, but as the first drops of rain began to smear the soot on my windshield, I knew one thing for certain: the thumb fawn wasn't finished. I was going to find out what Phoenix was, and I was going to make sure that before I truly died, the truth would burn even brighter than my home. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists inside a moving car in the middle of a rainy night, a silence that feels heavy enough to crush the breath right out of your lungs. As I drove that rusted Ford truck through the winding back roads of Virginia, the world outside was nothing but a blur of gray shadows and weeping trees. My hands were still shaking, stained with the soot of a home that had been my pride and was now my funeral pyre. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the flickering lights of a police cruiser, or the cold, unwavering stare of my son Julian, but there was only the vast, unforgiving darkness. My life had collapsed in the span of a single heartbeat, and as the reality of Eleanor's betrayal began to settle into my bones, I realized that I wasn't just running from a fire. I was running from 40 years of a lie, so carefully constructed that I had walked right into my own execution with a smile on my face. Every happy memory, every shared anniversary, every quiet morning we spent, sipping coffee on the veranda, now felt like a drop of poison that I had willingly swallowed. I was a man who had spent his career dissecting the truth, yet I had been the easiest mark in the world. Now, with nothing but a leather-bound ledger and a dying truck, I had to find a way to make sense of the wreckage before the people who called me husband and father finished what they started. The rain turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the metal roof of the truck, a sound that usually would have soothed me after a long day at the courthouse. Tonight, it felt like a countdown. I pulled into the gravel lot of a small, forgotten rest stop near the Blue Ridge Parkway, the kind of place where the asphalt is cracked and the fluorescent lights hum with a dying flicker. I didn't turn off the engine. I couldn't risk the old Ford not starting again, and the low rumble of the motor was the only thing keeping the silence at bay. My tuxedo was ruined, the silk lapels torn and smelling of acrid smoke, and as I reached into the glove box to find a rag to wipe the grime from my face, my fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, tucked deep into the back behind the freight owner's manual. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat. It was a small, silver digital voice recorder, the kind my younger brother, Thomas, used to carry everywhere. Thomas had been the wild one, the investigative journalist who lived for the story, while I lived for the law. 10 years ago, he was killed in a hit-and-run in downtown Richmond, A case that was ruled a tragic accident by the police, and one that I, in my grief and my rigid trust in the system, had accepted without question. Seeing his recorder now, hidden in this truck that I had inherited from his estate but rarely used, felt like a cold hand touching the back of my neck. I held the device in my palm, the metal cold against my skin. I remembered Thomas telling me, weeks before he died, that he was working on a story that would shake the foundations of the Sterling name. I had laughed it off, telling him to leave the drama for the movies. I felt a surge of nausea as I pressed the power button. The small screen glowed a faint, ghostly blue. There was only one file saved on the memory card, dated 3 days before his death. I took a deep breath, the air in the cab smelling of old tobacco and damp upholstery, and pressed play. Arthur, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you to your face. And knowing how much you love that woman, I'm not even sure you'd listen. Thomas's voice came through, sounding thin and distorted through the tiny speaker, but his tone was unmistakable. He sounded terrified. I started looking into the land acquisitions for the Sterling Foundation. You think Eleanor is building schools in South America, Arthur. You think she's a saint. But she's not. She's using your name, your judicial seals, to move assets for a group I can't fully identify yet. They call it Phoenix. I closed my eyes, my forehead resting against the cold steering wheel. The name Silas had mentioned. Phoenix. It wasn't a new nightmare. It was an old one that I had been too blind to see. She's not who you think she is, big brother. The recording continued, Thomas's breath hitching. I looked into her family history. The stuff she told you was destroyed in that fire in Chicago when she was a girl. It was a lie. Her father didn't die an innocent man. He was a disgraced broker you prosecuted in your first year as a DA. He died in prison, Arthur. She didn't marry you for love. She married the man who broke her family so she could rebuild it on your back. She's been playing the long game for 30 years, and I think she knows I'm onto her. If something happens to me, look at the offshore accounts tied to the Laurel Group. Don't trust the smile, Arthur. For the love of God, don't trust the smile. The recording ended with a sharp click, followed by the hollow hiss of static. I sat there in the dark, the rain blurring the world outside into a watercolor of grief. 10 years. For 10 years, I had lived with the woman who had likely ordered my brother's death, the woman who had slept beside me while she systematically dismantled my integrity. My brother had tried to warn me, and I had chosen the comfort of my beautiful wife over the frantic words of my own blood. I had presided over 1,000 cases, judged 1,000 men, but I was the most guilty man of all. I had failed to protect my brother, and in doing so, I had handed my son over to a monster to be raised in her image. Julian, my son. I thought of his cold smile as he watched the house burn. He wasn't just his mother's accomplice. He was her masterpiece. She had taken the Sterling name, a name that stood for honor, and turned it into a weapon. A pair of headlights swept across the rest stop, the bright beams cutting through the rain and reflecting off my mirrors. I froze, my hand instinctively dropping to the floorboard where I kept a heavy tire iron. The car, a dark sedan, slowed down as it passed my truck, the engine a low predatory purr. I held my breath, the silver recorder still clutched in my hand like a talisman. The car lingered for a moment, the driver's side window tinted and opaque, before it slowly accelerated and disappeared back onto the highway. Maybe it was just a traveler. Maybe it was them. In this new world, there was no such thing as a coincidence. I looked down at the recorder. Thomas had died, trying to tell me that Eleanor's father was a man I had sent to prison. I tried to reach back into the foggy memories of my early career, the hundreds of faces that had passed through my courtroom. I remembered a man named Victor Vance, a white-collar criminal, a man who had wept as I read the sentence. He had a young daughter. I remembered seeing her in the gallery, a pale girl with intense, dark eyes. Eleanor. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't saved her from a tragic past. I had been the architect of her suffering, and she had spent 40 years ensuring that my downfall would be slow, total, and agonizing. Every kiss had been a payment on a debt of revenge. I reached for the ledger I had taken from the safe. I needed to see the names. I needed to see how far the rot went. But more than that, I needed to talk to the one person I had pushed away, because she saw through Eleanor's mask years ago. My daughter, Clara. She had left home at 19, calling her mother a hollow statue, and I had stood by Eleanor, telling my daughter she was being dramatic and ungrateful. I started the truck, the engine groaning as it slipped into gear. The Blue Ridge Mountains were a wall of blackness ahead of me, but for the first time in 40 years, the fog in my mind was starting to clear. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a man who had spent his life studying the mechanics of justice, and if my wife wanted a trial by fire, I was going to give it to her. I drove back onto the road, the voice of my dead brother echoing in my ears, a ghost finally leading me toward the truth. The weight of a man's reputation is a strange thing. It takes a lifetime to build, brick by heavy brick, but only a single night of fire to realize those bricks were made of sand. Sitting in that old Ford truck, the recording of my brother Thomas still ringing in my ears like a final, desperate warning from beyond the grave, I looked at the leather-bound ledger I had snatched from the flames. For 40 years, I was Judge Arthur Sterling, the man whose signature meant the final word of the law in the state of Virginia. I was the personification of order, a man who believed that if you followed the rules, the world would treat you fairly. I had walked through the halls of power with a sense of quiet righteousness, never realizing that the very shadow I cast was being used to hide the darkest corners of human depravity. It is a haunting thing to realize that your life's work, every verdict you gave, and every oath you took, was merely a smokescreen for the people you loved most. Eleanor and Julian didn't just want my money. They wanted my name because a judge's name is the ultimate hall pass. It opens doors that are supposed to be locked, and it silences questions that are supposed to be asked. As the rain hammered against the roof of the truck, I felt the sickening realization that I had spent 4 decades as the unintentional guardian of a criminal empire. I drove until the sky began to bleed into a bruised, pre-dawn purple, pulling into a small public library in a town far enough from Richmond to feel anonymous, but close enough to access the digital archives I needed. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was gaunt, smeared with ash, and my eyes looked like those of a man who had seen a ghost. I suppose I had. I put on a worn baseball cap and a heavy flannel shirt I kept in the back of the truck, trying to mask the ruined tuxedo that whispered of a life I no longer possessed. I waited in the cold air until the doors opened, and then I slipped into a corner cubicle in the back, away from the morning regulars. My hands were stiff as I plugged the flash drive into the library's computer. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I was sure the woman at the next desk could hear it. If you are someone who has always believed that family is the ultimate safe harbor, the place where you are protected from the storms of the world, then the details I'm about to share might change your mind forever. I hope you stay with me until the end of this chapter, because the story is about to shift toward a devastating truth that I, Arthur, never expected to uncover. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the turning points in this confrontation. As the files on the screen flickered to life, I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me. I had expected to find offshore accounts or perhaps some tax evasion, the typical greed of the wealthy. But the Phoenix Project wasn't just about money. It was about the systematic exploitation of the very legal system I had sworn to protect. There were spreadsheets, meticulously kept, showing charitable donations from the Sterling Foundation flowing into shell companies like the Laurel Group. But it was the destination of those funds that stopped my breath. The money wasn't being used for schools or hospitals. It was being routed to private transport companies and security firms that operated in the shadows of the Norfolk shipping docks and the Mexican border. I stared at a scanned document, a judicial authorization for a high-security transport bypass, a document that bore my own signature. My stomach did a slow, painful flip. I remembered signing that. Eleanor had brought it to me in my study 3 years ago, draped in her emerald silk robe, smelling of lavender and expensive wine. Asterisk. It's for the humanitarian relief crates, Arthur. Asterisk. She had whispered, kissing my cheek. Asterisk. The bureaucracy is slowing down the medicine for the children in the camps. They just need your seal to expedite the customs check. Asterisk. And I, blinded by a lifetime of trust, had pressed my seal onto the paper without a second thought. I had handed her a key to the kingdom, and she had used it to bypass the very checks meant to stop the trafficking of human beings. The ledger was even worse. It contained coded logs of cargo arrivals, dates, times, and initials. I cross-referenced the dates with my own court calendar, and felt the room begin to spin. Every time I had been away on a high-profile circuit, every time Julian had worked late at the family firm, a shipment had moved. They weren't just laundering money, they were laundering lives. My reputation as a tough-on-crime judge was the perfect shield. Who would suspect a truck authorized by Judge Sterling? Who would dare search a warehouse funded by the Sterling Foundation? I sat back, the fluorescent lights of the library suddenly feeling too bright, too clinical. I thought of Julian's white-toothed smile at the anniversary party. I thought of how he had handed me that poisoned bourbon with such casual grace. He wasn't just a spoiled heir. He was a logistical mastermind who had turned his father's integrity into a business asset. He had looked at the law not as a set of rules to follow, but as a series of obstacles to be bypassed using the Sterling brand. "Can I help you with something, sir?" a soft voice asked. I jumped, my hand nearly knocking the mouse off the desk. A young librarian was standing there, looking at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I realized I had been staring at the screen for an hour. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. "No, I'm fine," I rasped, my voice cracking. "Just doing some genealogy research. Family history." "You look like you've had a long night," she said kindly. "There's coffee in the lobby if you need it." "Thank you," I said, quickly closing the windows on the screen and pulling out the flash drive. I couldn't stay there. If I could find this information, so could someone else. I needed to move. As I walked back to the truck, the morning sun felt like an intruder. The world was waking up, people were going to work, picking up dry cleaning, living their lives in the sunlight while I was realizing that my entire existence was built on a foundation of blood and betrayal. Eleanor Vance, no, she was a Vance. The daughter of the man I had put away hadn't just wanted to kill me, she had wanted to turn me into the very thing I hated. She had made me her silent partner in a trade that traded in souls. I climbed into the cab and gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold and cracked. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but underneath it, the old judge was returning. I had spent 40 years weighing evidence and seeking the truth. I knew how to build a case. Eleanor and Julian thought they had incinerated the evidence when they blew up my library, but they had forgotten one thing. A man like me never keeps all his secrets in one place. I put the truck in gear and started driving toward the coast, toward Norfolk. I needed to see the docks for myself. I needed to see the place where the Sterling name was being traded for human misery. But first, I had to find a way to reach Silas again. He was the only one who knew I was still breathing, and in this game of shadows, being a ghost was my only advantage. I looked at the silver recorder on the seat beside me. Thomas had died for this truth. I wouldn't let his death, or my life, be a footnote in Eleanor's revenge. The Sterling legacy was about to be rewritten, not in ink, but in the harsh, cold light of justice. There is a terrifying kind of clarity that comes when you have lost everything but the clothes on your back and the burning truth in your pocket. I spent my life believing that the law was a grand, immovable mountain. But as I sat in the cab of that old Ford, staring at the digital ghosts on my screen, I realized that for people like Eleanor and Julian, the law was just a veil, a thin, translucent fabric they used to drape over their monstrosities. It is one thing to know you were betrayed. It's quite another to realize that your very existence was the camouflage for a business that traded in human souls. Every time I had kissed Eleanor goodnight, every time I had congratulated Julian on a business deal, I was unknowingly blessing the blood on their hands. The world I knew, the one of pristine courtrooms and Sunday brunches, had dissolved into a landscape of shadows. I was no longer Judge Arthur Sterling. I was a man haunting the edges of his own life, realizing that the people I called family had spent decades perfecting the art of the lie. The air around me felt heavy with the scent of old ash and sea salt, a reminder that the deeper I dug, the more I would find that the foundations of my life were built on a graveyard of secrets I was never meant to uncover. The drive toward Norfolk was a long, meditative descent into the heart of the storm. The coastal fog began to roll in as I bypassed the main interstate, sticking to the secondary roads where the traffic was light and the eyes were few. My phone, the burner I had picked up at a gas station, vibrated on the passenger seat. There was no name, just a string of coordinates and a short, cryptic text. Asterisk. Warehouse 14, Pier 7. Look behind the false wall. The truth about Thomas isn't in the police report. Asterisk. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of my brother. The anonymous sender seemed to be a step ahead of me, a shadow watching a shadow. I didn't know if I was walking into a trap or a sanctuary, but as the rusted Ford rattled over the salt-crusted asphalt of the industrial district, I knew I didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The docks at night are a world of their own, a place of groaning metal, screaming gulls, and the rhythmic slapping of dark water against barnacled wood. It was here, in the cold, damp silence of the shipping yards, that the sterling name was being used as a master key for the unthinkable. I parked the truck 3 blocks away, tucked behind a row of rusted shipping containers that smelled of diesel and dead fish. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, a gray shroud that muffled my footsteps as I moved toward Pier 7. Warehouse 14 was a monolithic structure of corrugated tin, its windows boarded up like the eyes of a blind man. I found a side door that had been left slightly ajar, the rusted hinges groaning as I slipped inside. The interior was vast and echoing, filled with the smell of damp cardboard and something metallic. I switched on a small penlight, the thin beam cutting through the darkness like a needle. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, except for a set of fresh tire tracks that led toward the back of the building. My pulse thudded in my ears, a steady drumbeat of dread. I moved deeper into the warehouse, my shadow dancing long and distorted against the walls. In the far corner, tucked behind a stack of empty wooden crates, I found the section the text had mentioned. It looked like a solid brick pillar supporting the roof, but as I ran my fingers along the edge, I felt a slight seam. I pushed, and with a heavy, grinding sound, a portion of the wall swung inward. Behind it was a small, climate-controlled room, filled with filing cabinets and a single, high-end computer terminal. This was the nerve center, the place where the Sterling Foundation's humanitarian efforts were actually managed. But it wasn't the ledgers that caught my eye first. It was a cardboard box on the desk, labeled simply, Vance, Archive, *. I opened the box, my hands trembling. Inside were old newspaper clippings from 40 years ago, the trial of Victor Vance, Eleanor's father. But tucked between the clippings was a series of private investigator reports dated 10 years ago, just weeks before my brother Thomas died. I picked up a handwritten note. The ink faded, but the words sharp. It was Eleanor's handwriting. Thomas is getting too close to the Norfolk transfers. He's been seen at the Laurel Group offices twice this week. We can't afford a scandal now, especially with the Senate seat talk. Handle it. Make it look like his usual recklessness. I felt a wave of cold fury wash over me, so intense it made my vision blur. She hadn't just lied about her father. She had orchestrated the murder of my brother to protect the empire she was building on my back. I looked further into the box and found a mechanical report for a black sedan, the car that had struck Thomas. The invoice for the repairs was paid by a shell company owned by Julian, my son. He was only 24 at the time, already a cold-blooded apprentice in his mother's game. They had sat at Thomas's funeral, Eleanor weeping into a lace handkerchief while Julian stood tall and stoic by my side, offering me a glass of water that I now realized was just a dress rehearsal for the night of my own anniversary. I wondered if you'd find this place, a voice said from the darkness of the warehouse. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. A figure stepped into the pale light of the penlight. It was a man I hadn't seen in years. Clive Miller, my old bailiff, a man who had retired shortly after Thomas's death. He looked older, his face etched with a guilt that seemed to weigh him down. "Clive?" I rasped, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "Was it you? Did you send the text?" He nodded slowly, keeping his distance. "I saw things, Arthur. Years ago. I tried to tell myself I was wrong, that a man like you couldn't be involved in such things. But I watched Eleanor come and go from your chambers when you weren't there. I saw her taking the seals, the letterheads, and when Thomas died, I saw the car. Arthur. I saw Julian driving it back to the estate that night. I was too afraid to speak. They owned the police chief back then, and I had a family to think about. You let me live a lie for 10 years, Clive, I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. You let me sleep next to the woman who killed my brother. I'm a coward, Arthur. I know that, he whispered, his eyes casting downward. But when I heard about the fire at your house, I knew they finally came for you too. I couldn't let it end like this. Everything you need to bury them is in those files. The Phoenix Project isn't just about money, Arthur. It's about the people they move. They've been using your name to sign off on work visas for hundreds of women and children who disappear the moment they hit the docks. It's a slave trade, and your signature is the bridge they walk on. I looked back at the files, the sheer scale of the evil making my stomach turn. My reputation, the sterling name, was the fuel for a machine that destroyed lives. Eleanor hadn't just wanted revenge for her father. She wanted to replace the justice I stood for with a darkness so profound it would never be undone. "You have to go, Arthur," Clive said, his voice urgent. "Julian's men check this place every morning at dawn. If they find you here, there won't be enough of you left to bury." I grabbed the box, my arms straining under the weight of 10 years of blood and betrayal. I looked at Clive one last time. "Why now, Clive? Why help me now?" "Because I'm dying, Arthur," he said with a sad, thin smile. "And I'd like to see the truth win just once before I go." I slipped back out into the fog, the weight of the box feeling like a physical manifestation of my guilt. I had been a judge for 40 years, and yet I had been the most ignorant man in the state of Virginia. As I reached the truck and threw the box into the passenger seat, I looked toward the dark horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed through the mist. I wasn't just a man on the run anymore. I was a man with a dossier of death, and as I started the engine, I knew that the next time I saw Eleanor, I wouldn't be looking for an explanation. I would be looking for an ending. The hunter was now the prey, and the ghost of Arthur Sterling was coming back to reclaim the law. There is a particular kind of cold that doesn't come from the winter air, but from the sudden realization that the person who has slept beside you for 40 years views your entire existence as nothing more than a timer waiting to hit zero. I sat in the shadows of a rented sedan, parked across from a secluded estate in the outskirts of Middleburg, watching the warm glow of the windows and feeling like a ghost haunting the ruins of my own heart. For 4 decades, I believed Eleanor was the anchor of my soul, the woman who had stood by me as I climbed the judicial ladder, the mother of my children, and the keeper of our shared history. But as I sat there in the dark, clutching the files Clive had given me, I realized that every "I love you" she ever whispered was a calculated deposit into a fund for my eventual destruction. It's a paralyzing feeling to discover that your life wasn't a partnership, but a long-term investment for a predator. I wasn't a husband to her. I was a shield, a signature, and eventually, a hurdle that needed to be cleared. The sheer patience of her hatred is what terrifies me the most. The way she could pour me coffee, adjust my tie, and laugh at my jokes, all while counting down the days until she could finally watch me burn. The estate belonged to a high-ranking lobbyist, a man I had known for years and even played golf with on Sunday afternoons. It was the kind of place where privacy was bought with sprawling acres and iron gates, a perfect sanctuary for the monsters who wear silk and pearls. I had followed Eleanor's car from a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs with every turn she took. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to hear the truth from her own lips, because despite the ledgers and the recordings, a small, foolish part of me, the part that remembered the way she looked in the moonlight on our honeymoon, still wanted to believe I was wrong. I slipped out of the car, staying low in the tall grass of the neighboring field, moving toward the stone patio where the French doors were slightly ajar to let in the cool evening breeze. My knees ached, and my breath was shallow, but the adrenaline of a dying man is a powerful thing. I positioned myself behind a thick cluster of boxwoods, just a few feet from the open door. Inside, the room was decorated in the same understated elegance. Eleanor loved cream-colored furniture, expensive art, and the smell of jasmine tea. I saw her then. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, looking as composed and beautiful as she had at our anniversary party. Julian was standing by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, looking restless. There was a third person there, a man in a dark suit whose face remained in the shadows, but his posture suggested a cold, professional authority. "The fire didn't finish it, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice tight with an irritation that chilled me to the bone. "The fire marshal is asking questions. They found the safe, but it was empty. If he got out with those files, if he's still breathing somewhere." Eleanor didn't even flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, the clink of the porcelain against the saucer sounding like a gunshot in the quiet night. Arthur is a man of habit, Julian. He's 68 years old, and far too sentimental for his own good. If he's alive, he's hiding in a hole somewhere, nursing his broken heart. He doesn't have the stomach for this kind of war. He spent 40 years believing in the sanctity of the law. A man like that is paralyzed when the law turns its back on him. But the Phoenix transfers are stalled, the man in the shadows added, his voice low and raspy. Without his verified signature on the new customs waivers, the Norfolk shipments are sitting ducks. We need the estate settled. We need the power of attorney to move from temporary to permanent. Eleanor leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. The warmth I had known for 40 years was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory hunger that made her eyes look like shards of black glass. Arthur has lived far too long as it is, she said, her voice dropping to a cold, flat whisper. I have spent half my life playing the part of the dutiful wife to the man who destroyed my father. I have smiled through every boring dinner, every tedious ceremony, and every night in that bed, waiting for this moment. We cannot wait for a body to be identified in the rubble. We need the will executed immediately. If the accident didn't take him, then we find him and we finish it properly. I want his name cleared from the accounts, and I want his legacy buried under the weight of the Phoenix Project. He was a useful fool, but his time has run out. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. A useful fool. 40 years of my life, 40 years of devotion, summed up in 3 words by the woman I had worshipped. She hadn't just been stealing my name, she had been savoring the irony of it. She had watched me uphold the law while she used my very hands to break it, enjoying the secret knowledge that the great Judge Sterling was nothing more than her unwitting accomplice. I looked at Julian, expecting to see some flicker of hesitation, some small remnant of the son I had raised. But he just nodded, staring into the fire with a look of cold ambition that mirrored his mother's. I've already contacted the coroner's office, Julian said. With enough pressure, they'll issue a presumptive death certificate by the end of the week. Then the Sterling Foundation becomes ours, and Phoenix can move into the next phase. Good, Eleanor said, sitting back and closing her eyes as if she were imagining a peaceful future. I want to be done with the ghost of Arthur Sterling. I want to wake up in a world where that name belongs to us, and the man who carried it is nothing but a footnote in a tragedy. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling so violently I had to press them against the cold stone of the house to keep from making a sound. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I thought I might collapse right there on the patio. I had seen the worst of humanity in my courtroom. Murderers, thieves, and predators of all kinds, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer, calculated cruelty of my own family. I wasn't just a victim of a crime. I was the victim of a 40-year-long assassination of my character. I stumbled back through the field toward my car, the sounds of the night, the crickets, the wind in the trees feeling like a mockery. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there in the dark, the silence of the car feeling like a tomb. I looked at my hands in the dim light of the dashboard. They were old, wrinkled, and scarred from a lifetime of living. For the first time, I didn't see a judge. I didn't see a husband. I saw a man who had been stripped of everything but his anger. Eleanor thought I was paralyzed by my belief in the law. She thought my sentimentality made me weak. She thought the great Arthur Sterling would crawl into a corner and wait to die because his world had been shattered. But she forgot one thing. I spent 40 years studying the minds of criminals. I knew how they thought, how they moved, and how they eventually tripped over their own arrogance. She wanted to execute my will. She wanted to bury my legacy. I started the engine, the low growl of the car sounding like a promise. I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. They owned the pieces on the board, but I was the one who knew the board better than anyone. If Eleanor wanted a world without the ghost of Arthur Sterling, I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I was going to be the ghost that haunted every move she made. I was going to be the shadow in the corner of her empire, the whisper in the ear of her partners, and the judge who would eventually read her final sentence. My belief in the law wasn't a weakness. It was the weapon I was going to use to dismantle everything she had built. I pulled out of the shadows and onto the road, heading toward the one place where the truth couldn't be burned, the home of my daughter, Clara. It was time to stop being a fool and start being a Sterling. There is a unique bitterness in realizing that your survival is no longer a matter of luck, but a strategic inconvenience to the people who used to kiss you goodnight. As I drove away from that secluded estate in Middleburg, the words of Eleanor calling me a useful fool echoed in the cabin of my car like a persistent, rhythmic thud. It's one thing to be hunted by an enemy you've sentenced from the bench. It's quite another to be hunted by the very legacy you spent 40 years building. I had become a ghost in my own life, a man stripped of his home, his name, and his family, left with nothing but a bruised spirit and a set of files that felt heavier than lead. The silence of the Virginia backroads wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. I could feel the invisible net tightening around me, the digital eyes of the Phoenix Project scanning every highway camera and cell tower, looking for a 68-year-old man who was supposed to be Ash. I was alone, truly and utterly alone, navigating a world where the laws I once worshipped had been weaponized against me. The weight of that solitude is a cold, suffocating blanket, but in that darkness, I found a spark of something I hadn't felt in decades, the raw, unfiltered instinct of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Thưa các bạn, đôi khi trong cuộc đời, chúng ta hy sinh cả thanh xuân để xây dựng tổ ấm, để rồi nhận ra mình chỉ là một quân cờ trong tay những người mình yêu thương nhất. Cảm giác bị bỏ quên, bị phản bội ngay trong chính căn nhà của mình là nỗi đau thấu tận tâm can. Nếu bạn cũng từng cảm thấy cô đơn giữa những người thân thuộc, bạn sẽ hiểu tại sao Arthur lại kiên cường đến vậy trong đêm đông lạnh lẽo này. I pulled into the parking lot of a motel called the Whispering Pines, though there were no pines and the only whispering came from the flickering neon sign that hummed with a dying electrical buzz. It was a place where people went to disappear, a sprawling, two-story U-shaped building with peeling paint and the faint smell of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. I paid the clerk in cash, a tired man behind bulletproof glass who didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle, and took a room on the second floor, right at the corner. My training as a judge had always been about the macro view of justice, the big picture of the law, but as I locked the door behind me and pushed a heavy dresser against it, my focus narrowed down to the micro. I was back in the courtroom of my own mind, weighing the evidence of my surroundings. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the window, peering through a crack in the heavy polyester curtains, watching the entrance to the lot. My heart was a steady, rhythmic pulse in my throat. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Then, a silver sedan with tinted windows drifted slowly into the lot, its headlights extinguished. It didn't park in a spot. It hovered near the shadows of the dumpster. I knew that move. I'd seen it in surveillance footage 1,000 times during criminal trials. They hadn't found me through luck. They had found me through the one thing I couldn't discard: my medical history. My heart medication has a digital footprint every time a prescription is flagged or a specific insurance query is made. Julian was smart. He knew my body would betray me before my mind did. I watched two men step out of the car. They weren't street thugs. They moved with a synchronized professional economy, wearing dark tactical jackets and earpieces. These were the contractors Eleanor's lobbyists used to settle estates. I felt a surge of cold fury. They weren't coming for a conversation. They were coming to fulfill the presumptive death Julian had promised. I looked around the room. It was a pathetic stage for a final stand, but as a judge, I knew that every environment had its own set of rules. I took the small glass ice bucket from the dresser and placed it on the floor just inside the door, tilted at a precarious angle. Then, I took the heavy iron from the closet and tied its cord to the handle of the bathroom door, creating a tension wire across the narrow entryway. It was crude, something from a different era, but in a world of high-tech surveillance, the analog is often the most invisible. I didn't stay in the room. I slipped out through the bathroom's small frosted window, dropping onto the rusted metal walkway of the service stairs. The winter air bit into my lungs, but I didn't shiver. I moved to the room next door unoccupied, according to the lack of a car outside, and picked the lock with the small kit I'd kept in my fishing bag for years. I sat in the darkness of the neighboring room, the wall between us thin enough to hear the heavy footfalls on the outdoor carpet. I heard the door to my original room give way a muffled thud times as they kicked it in. Then, the sharp, crystalline sound of the ice bucket shattering on the floor. I heard a low, whispered curse. They were inside, moving toward the bed, their silenced weapons drawn. They would find a pile of pillows under the moth-eaten bedspread, a decoy that bought me exactly 3 seconds. I didn't wait for them to realize the bed was empty. I stepped out onto the walkway behind them. Looking for the ghost? I said, my voice low and steady, the voice I used when I was ready to read a sentence that carried no hope of parole. One of them spun around, his weapon rising, but his foot caught on the cord I'd strung across the threshold. He stumbled, his momentum carrying him into the doorframe. I didn't have a gun, but I had a heavy brass fire extinguisher I'd pulled from the hallway wall. I swung it with every ounce of the 40 years of suppressed rage I carried. The impact was dull and heavy, and the man went down without a sound. The second man was faster. He dove behind the dresser I'd pushed earlier, returning fire. The times fut-fut times of the silenced rounds tearing through the cheap drywall was the only sound in the night. I retreated back into the shadows of the second room, my mind working through the geometry of the space. He thought I was trapped, but he forgot that I had spent my life studying the way people react under pressure. A man like that, a professional, expects you to hide. He doesn't expect you to prosecute. I grabbed a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol from my first aid kit and a box of matches. I didn't want to burn the place down, but I needed a diversion. I splashed the liquid on a pile of old newspapers in the corner of the hallway and struck a match. The flame took hold instantly, a bright, dancing orange that cast long, terrifying shadows. "Fire!" I yelled, my voice cracking with feigned panic. "Everyone out! The building is going up!" I heard doors opening down the hall, the sounds of confused travelers waking up. The gunman hesitated. In a crowded motel, a silenced weapon loses its primary advantage: anonymity. He couldn't kill everyone. He looked toward the flames, then toward the man I'd knocked out. He realized the mission had shifted from an assassination to a liability. He didn't pursue me. He grabbed his partner by the collar, dragging him toward the stairs as the first screams of the other guests began to fill the air. I watched them disappear into the silver sedan and roar out of the lot, their tires screeching on the wet asphalt. I stood there in the smoke, my chest heaving, the fire extinguisher still heavy in my hand. I was 68 years old, my tuxedo was a rag, and I was standing in a burning motel hallway in the middle of a Virginia winter. I should have been terrified. I should have been broken. But as I watched the tail lights of my son's killers fade into the distance, I felt a strange, icy clarity. I wasn't just a useful fool anymore. I was a man who had just looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was afraid of the light. I didn't wait for the fire department. I slipped back to my truck, my hands finally steady. I had used my mind to survive, but I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I was tired of being the prey. I needed the one person who had been right all along, the daughter who had seen the rot in Eleanor's soul when I was too blinded by love to look. I turned the key, the old Ford groaning to life, and headed toward the one place where the sterling name might still mean something other than betrayal. Clara's house was 100 miles away, but for the first time since the anniversary party, I knew exactly where I was going. The game of cat and mouse was over. It was time for the judge to find his witness. Forgiveness is a heavy thing to ask for when you've spent a lifetime building a pedestal for the people who were secretly dismantling your soul. As I drove through the pre-dawn fog toward the outskirts of Charlottesville, the image of my daughter's face kept flashing before me, not the woman she had become, but the 19-year-old girl who had stood in our foyer with a packed suitcase, telling me that the house felt like a mausoleum, and that my wife's smile was nothing but a cold marble facade. At the time, I had used my most authoritative judicial voice to tell her she was being cruel, that she was ungrateful for the life we had provided. I had chosen the lie because the lie was comfortable, and in doing so, I had severed the only honest tether I had left in this world. Now, covered in the soot of my own mistakes, and hunted by the son I had foolishly championed, I was heading toward her porch to admit that the useful fool was finally ready to listen. The road felt longer than 100 miles. It felt like a journey across a decade of silence, each mile marker a reminder of the birthdays missed and the letters I had never sent. I was a man who had spent his career demanding the truth from strangers, yet I had spent my entire life hiding from the truth that lived in my daughter's eyes. The house was a small, weathered farmhouse at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to watch me with a quiet, judgmental stillness. It was the kind of place Eleanor would have looked at with a thin, polite curl of her lip. But to me, in the dim light of the early morning, it looked like a fortress. I pulled the rusted Ford to a stop, the engine coughing one last time before dying into a heavy silence. My hands were gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles had turned the color of bone. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The torn tuxedo, the singed eyebrows, the hollowed-out eyes of a man who had been declared dead by his own family. I looked like a ghost, and in many ways, I was. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my dress shoes like broken glass, and walked toward the porch. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had faced down career criminals and powerful lobbyists without blinking, but the thought of facing my daughter made my knees feel like water. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open. Clara stood there, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, a mug of steaming coffee in her hand. She didn't scream. She didn't even look surprised. She just looked at me with a profound, weary sadness, as if she had been waiting for this specific ghost to show up for a long, long time. "You're late, Dad," she said, her voice quiet and steady, lacking the sharp edge I remembered from our final argument. "I saw the news about the fire yesterday. I figured it would take you about 24 hours to realize you didn't have anywhere else to go." "Clara," I rasped, the name catching in my dry throat. I don't even know how to begin." "Then don't," she replied, stepping aside to let me in. "Come inside. You smell like a chimney and you're shivering. I'll get you some of Thomas's old clothes. I kept them after the funeral, since you were too busy comforting Mom to take them." The interior of the house was warm and smelled of cinnamon and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile, museum-like perfection of the Sterling estate. I sat at her small kitchen table, my tuxedo jacket draped over the back of the chair like a discarded skin. Clara moved with a quiet efficiency, setting a bowl of oatmeal in front of me and sitting down across from the table. For a few minutes, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the soft whistle of the wind outside. "I saw them, Clara," I said finally, my eyes fixed on the steam rising from the bowl. "I heard your mother. I heard Julian. They think I'm dead. They wanted me dead." "I know," she said, her voice devoid of shock. "They've wanted you out of the way for a long time, Dad. You were the golden goose. You provided the name, the signatures, and the moral cover. But the more Julian got involved with the Foundation's expansion, the more you became a liability. You're too honest to be a partner, but too useful to let go. Until now." I looked up at her, really looked at her. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a hardness that she hadn't possessed when she left. "How do you know all this?" "You haven't spoken to them in years." Clara stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner. She pulled out a heavy, battered laptop and a thick accordion folder. She brought them back to the table and slid them toward me. "I didn't just leave to get away from Mom, Dad. I left to find out why Thomas died. I knew that hit and run wasn't an accident. Thomas called me 2 nights before it happened. He was scared. He told me he'd found something in the Sterling consulting ledgers, something about Phoenix. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Silas mentioned Phoenix. Thomas's recorder mentioned it too. I've been building a case for 6 years, Dad," Clara whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the laptop. "I didn't tell you because you wouldn't have believed me. You were so deeply under her spell that you would have gone straight to her with the misunderstandings your daughter was having, and she would have buried me, just like she buried Thomas." She opened the laptop and began scrolling through a series of encrypted files. There were photographs of shipping containers in Norfolk, scanned bank transfers from the Sterling Foundation to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and most devastatingly, a series of internal emails between Julian and a man named Cal Whitaker. "Whitaker is the architect," Clara explained, her voice hardening. "Mom is the face of the operation. Julian handles the logistics, and Whitaker provides the political and military connections to move the cargo. They aren't just laundering money, Dad. They're using the Sterling name to move experimental weapon specs and, occasionally, people who don't want to be found. They've turned your entire judicial career into a private highway for the black market." "I signed those papers," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I gave them the seals. I thought I was helping children, Clara. I thought I was doing good." "That's exactly what they counted on," she said, reaching across the table to put her hand over mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "But here's what they don't know. I have the secondary ledgers. Thomas found a backdoor server Julian was using to track the real profits. I've been siphoning data from it for months. I have enough to put them away for life, but I didn't have a witness. I didn't have someone who could testify to the signatures, to the private conversations, to the rot inside that house. She looked me dead in the eye, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in the darkness. They think Judge Arthur Sterling died in that fire. They think they've won. But you're the only person who can walk into a courtroom and dismantle everything they've built. You're the only one who can verify that your seals were stolen and your trust was weaponized. I failed you, Clara, I said, the weight of my shame finally breaking my voice. I failed Thomas. I failed everyone. You did, she said, not sugarcoating the truth, but you're still breathing. And as long as you are, the law still has a voice. We have the evidence, Dad. We have the names, but we have to be careful. Whitaker has people everywhere, police, feds, even the coroner's office. If they find out you're here, they won't use a fire next time. I looked at the files on the screen, the systematic destruction of my life's work. I thought of Eleanor's cold disappointment at the dinner table and Julian's predatory smile as the library burned. My grief hadn't vanished, but it had been forged into something else, something sharper. I wasn't just a father looking for a place to hide anymore. I was a judge who had just found his lead investigator. What do we do now? I asked. Clara closed the laptop with a definitive snap. We don't go to the police. Not yet. We go to the source. There's a secret meeting happening in 48 hours at the old Sterling Law offices in Arlington. Whitaker is coming in to finalize the transfer of your estate to the foundation. If we can get in there, if we can document that meeting, I'll be there, I said, standing up. My body was old, and my heart was broken, but as I looked at my daughter, I realized that the Sterling legacy wasn't the house or the name. It was the woman standing in front of me, the one who had stayed in the shadows to keep the truth alive. I took a deep breath, the air in the small farmhouse feeling cleaner than any air I'd breathed in 40 years. I'm done being a fool, Clara. It's time to be a father. There is a specific kind of horror that comes with realizing your entire life's work was used as a blueprint for the destruction of the very thing you swore to protect. I had spent 40 years believing that the black robe I wore was a symbol of an impartial, sacred truth. But sitting in the dim light of Clara's farmhouse, watching the rain smear the window pane, I felt like a man who had discovered he'd been building a cathedral for a cult of thieves. Every ruling I made, every precedent I cited, had been carefully monitored and manipulated by the woman I shared my bed with. I wasn't just a victim, I was a facilitator. Eleanor hadn't just stolen my heart, she had stolen my conscience and used it as a shield for her father's revenge. To understand that your son, the boy you taught to ride a bike, the man you thought would carry your legacy, was actually a willing participant in the slow dismantling of your soul is a pain that doesn't just hurt, it hollows you out. As Clara and I prepared to dig into the final, darkest layers of the Phoenix Project, I felt like I was descending into a tomb, looking for a truth that was buried so deep it had begun to rot everything it touched. The air in the room grew cold, not from the Virginia winter, but from the realization that once we opened the next door, there would be no going back to the man I used to be. The basement of the old Sterling Law offices in Arlington didn't feel like a professional space, it felt like a crypt. The building had been in our family for 3 generations, a stately brick structure that once stood for the finest legal minds in the state. But as Clara and I slipped through the service entrance at 3 in the morning, our footsteps echoing against the damp concrete of the sublevel storage, the smell of mildew and old paper felt like the scent of decaying secrets. Clara led the way with a small tactical flashlight, her movements precise and hushed. I followed behind, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, feeling more like a burglar than a former thumb fan. We were looking for the physical archives of Phoenix, the one thing Julian and Eleanor couldn't fully trust to the digital world, because even they knew that a server can be wiped, but a signed ledger is a permanent stain. Thomas told me about a hidden vault behind the civil records, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the building's ancient ventilation system. He said our grandfather had it built during the Cold War for sensitive documents. Eleanor found it years ago, but she never changed the access. She thought the only people who knew about it were either dead or under her thumb. We reached a wall of heavy gray filing cabinets, the metal cold and pitted with age. Clara didn't pull the drawers. Instead, she reached behind the baseboard of the 3rd cabinet and clicked a small, hidden latch. With a heavy metallic groan that made my heart leap into my throat, a section of the wall disguised as a structural pillar swung back an inch. I put my shoulder to it, pushing against 40 years of lies, and the door opened into a small, windowless room that smelled of cedar and ozone. Inside, the room was surprisingly clean, lit by a single motion sensor bulb that flickered to life. There were no stacks of cash or illegal weapons. Instead, there was a single mahogany desk and a wall of black binders, each one labeled with a year. My hands trembled as I reached for the binder, labeled with the current year. I opened it, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a list of offshore accounts. It was a list of names. Names of men and women I had known for decades. My colleagues, my friends, fellow judges from the circuit court, the appellate court, and even 2 from the state Supreme Court. Next to each name was a dollar figure, a date, and a specific case number. "It's a payroll, Dad," Clara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "Project Phoenix. It isn't just about moving cargo. It's about the infrastructure. They weren't just bypassing the law. They were buying it. Eleanor wasn't just using your name to clear shipments. She was using the Sterling Foundation's charitable grants to pay off the very people who would have presided over any challenges to their operation." I sank into the wooden chair, the weight of the binder feeling like a physical blow to my chest. I looked at a name, Judge Marcus Thorne. Marcus and I had been roommates in law school. We had been the best man at each other's weddings. According to the ledger, he had received 3 educational grants totaling $500,000 in exchange for a favorable ruling on a maritime injunction involving the Norfolk docks. She turned the entire Virginia judiciary into a franchise. I rasped, my voice sounding like broken glass. Every time I sat at a bench meeting, every time I shared a drink at the Bar Association gala, I was sitting in a room full of people she owned. And they looked at me and saw a man who was either a co-conspirator or a fool. They saw a man who provided the perfect cover. "Dad," Clara said, leaning over my shoulder to look at the list. "Look at this column. Verified by AS. That's you. She forged your internal review signatures to tell these judges that the grants were ethically sound and pre-vetted by your office. She didn't just buy them. She lied to them using your reputation as the bait. They thought they were taking clean money because Judge Arthur Sterling said it was okay." I felt a surge of nausea, so profound I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Eleanor had systematically dismantled the integrity of the state's legal system, using me as the unwitting architect. She hadn't just wanted revenge for her father. She wanted to prove that the law itself was a sham, a hollow shell that could be bought and sold by anyone with enough patience and a pretty smile. She had made me the face of a judicial plague. "We have to take this to the feds, Clara," I said, my voice rising with a desperate urgency. "We have to stop this now." "We can't just walk in with a book, Dad," she replied, her eyes sharp and focused. "Whitaker has people in the federal prosecutor's office, too. Look at the last page." I flipped to the back of the binder. There was a section labeled Phase 3, the estate. Below it was a typed timeline. The date of the anniversary party was marked with a red circle. Below that, it read, * Arthur Sterling, deceased. Julian Sterling to assume foundation chair. Whitaker to finalize transition of maritime assets. Final judicial clearance for Phoenix through Thorne and Vance. * Vance. The name hit me like a lightning strike. "She has a judge named Vance on the bench?" I asked, my mind racing. "There is no Judge Vance in Virginia. Look at the appointment schedule for next month." Clara pointed to a printed email. Julian was lobbying for a gubernatorial appointment for a special master position in the Norfolk district. They were going to appoint a young lawyer named Sarah Vance, Eleanor's niece, her brother's daughter. They were completing the circle, Dad. They were going to have a Vance back on the bench, sitting in your seat, using your money, while you were buried in an accidental fire. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a 40-year plan coming to a perfect, bloody fruition. I looked around the small vault, at the rows of binders that represented the total corruption of everything I had ever believed in. I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me. The shock was gone, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp as a razor. I wasn't just a judge anymore. I was the only person left who knew where all the bodies were buried, and I was the only witness who couldn't be bought. They think they've finished the story, I said, standing up and grabbing the binder. They think the tomb is sealed. Arthur? Clara asked, watching me closely. We aren't going to the police yet, I said, my voice steady and cold. We're going to that meeting in Arlington. I want to be there when Whitaker tries to sign my life away. I want to see Eleanor's face when the ghost she created walks into the room and reads her the final verdict. Clara nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. I've got the digital backups, Dad, and I've got the footage from the warehouse. We have everything. Not everything, I said, looking at the names of my betrayed colleagues. We still need to show them that the law doesn't belong to the Sterlings or the Vances. It belongs to the truth. We slipped out of the vault, leaving the sublevel of the law offices behind. As we climbed back into the truck, the first light of dawn was beginning to gray the horizon over the Potomac. I looked at my hands, the hands that had signed 1,000 warrants and sentenced 1,000 men. They were steady now. I was a man who had been declared dead, and there is nothing more dangerous than a ghost who still knows how to speak the truth. The meeting was in 24 hours, and I was going to make sure it was the last one Project Phoenix ever held. The silence of an empty courtroom at midnight is unlike any other silence in the world. It's a heavy, expectant stillness, as if the very walls are saturated with the echoes of thousands of life-altering decisions, waiting for the final gavel to fall. As I stood in the shadows of the gallery of the old Fairfax courthouse, the building where I had spent the most formative years of my career, I felt like a man attending his own wake. The air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old, bound leather, the scent of my life's devotion. For 40 years, I believed this wood and stone represented the absolute peak of human integrity, never suspecting that the woman I loved was using my reverence for this place to mask a rot that reached the very core of our state. Tonight, I wasn't here to preside. I was here to set a stage. My home had been burned, my brother had been murdered, and my son had been turned into a predator, all in the name of a legacy that was built on a foundation of lies. Eleanor and Julian thought they were coming here to finalize the transition of a dead man's estate, to sign the papers that would officially bury Arthur Sterling and breathe life into Project Phoenix. They didn't realize that a ghost has no need for a will, and that the most dangerous place for a criminal is in the presence of a judge who no longer believes in mercy. I had spent the last 6 hours meticulously preparing the room. Using the keys I'd kept since my tenure as chief judge, I had bypassed the security systems and entered through the judge's chambers. Clara was hidden in the clerk's booth, her laptop connected to the courtroom's digital display system, her fingers flying across the keys to ensure every piece of evidence we had gathered, the recordings, the ledgers, the photos from the Norfolk docks, was queued and ready. I had sent the message to Eleanor and Julian through an anonymous legal service, a formal summons to a pre-probate mediation regarding a secret trust I had allegedly established. It was the only bait they would swallow. Greed was the one thing more powerful than their caution. I knew they would come together, likely with Cal Whitaker in tow, to ensure that no part of the Sterling fortune remained outside their grasp. I sat in the high-backed leather chair behind the bench, the same chair I had occupied for decades. In the dim, ambient light of the emergency lamps, I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The fear that had paralyzed me on the night of the fire had been replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. I heard the heavy bronze doors at the back of the courtroom groan open. The sound echoed through the hollow space, followed by the rhythmic clicking of heels and the confident stride of men who believed they owned the ground they walked on. Is this some kind of joke? Julian's voice boomed, dripping with an arrogance that made my jaw tighten. Who calls a mediation at midnight in a decommissioned courtroom? It's theatrics, Julian, Eleanor replied, her voice smooth and melodic as ever. I could almost hear the slight smile on her face. Arthur always did have a flair for the dramatic. Even from the grave, he wants us to remember who was in charge. I don't like it, a third voice said, Cal Whitaker. The lawyer who sent the summons isn't answering his phone. We should have brought more security. Relax, Cal, Julian said. The estate is in probate. The fire marshal already signed off. This is just some old clerk trying to squeeze a few more dollars out of a secret clause. We sign the papers, we take the trust, and we finish Phoenix. They walked down the center aisle, passing the rows of benches where so many families had waited for my word. They reached the bar and stopped, looking up toward the elevated bench where I sat, hidden by the high wooden front and the deep shadows. "We're here," Eleanor called out, her voice echoing. "Whoever is presiding over this matter, let's be quick. We have a busy morning." I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with the scent of justice and old wood. I reached out and switched on the small desk lamp on the bench, the pool of light illuminating my face, and the black robe I had retrieved from my locker. "The court is now in session," I said, my voice projecting with the practiced resonance of 40 years of authority. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so thick it felt like it had physical weight. I watched Eleanor's face in the dim light. The composure she had maintained for 4 decades shattered in an instant. Her eyes widened, her skin turning a ghostly, translucent white. She didn't scream. She simply stopped breathing, her hand flying to her throat as if she were trying to catch the life that was escaping her. Julian stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the railing of the jury box, his mouth hanging open in a silent gasp of terror. Cal Whitaker reached for his jacket, but he froze when he saw the red dot of a laser sight from the tactical security Clara had quietly hired with the last of my private savings resting squarely on his chest. "Arthur?" Eleanor whispered, the name sounding like a prayer to a god she had long ago forsaken. "You look disappointed, Eleanor," I said, my voice as cold as the winter rain outside. "Were you expecting someone a bit more combustible?" You were in the house," Julian stammered, his face contorted with a mixture of shock and a rising, desperate panic. "The library. It blew. We saw the fire." I replied. "But as I've told you many times, Julian, a good judge always looks for the side exit. I suppose I should thank you. The fire was quite a spectacle. It gave me the anonymity I needed to see your mother's work from the outside." "Arthur, darling, please," Eleanor said, her voice trembling as she tried to reconstruct the mask of the loving wife. She took a tentative step toward the bench. "We were devastated. We thought we'd lost you." Julian was so distraught. "We only started the probate to protect your legacy, to keep the foundation from falling into the wrong hands." "Stop," I said, the word cutting through her lie like a scalpel. "The time for performances is over, Eleanor. I've spent 40 years listening to your scripts. I sat in the grass and watched you smoke a cigarette while our home burned. I heard you call me a useful fool in Middleburg. And I've seen the binders in the vault, Julian. I've seen the payroll for the judges you bought with my name. Only one step remains before the truth about Project Phoenix, and Eleanor's true face is fully revealed. A massive turning point awaits in the next chapter, so please stay with Arthur until the very last moment. If you feel this story is meaningful, you can hit the subscribe button to support the justice of this old judge." Julian looked at his mother, the realization that the game was up finally sinking in. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, animalistic survival instinct. "You have nothing, Dad. A bunch of old ledgers and some recordings? You're a dead man walking. The police? The courts? We own them. Who's going to believe a ghost who's been hiding in a farmhouse?" "It's not about who believes me, Julian," I said, leaning forward into the light. "It's about who's watching." I nodded toward the wall behind them. Suddenly, the large projector screen lowered, and the courtroom was filled with a bright blue light. A series of windows appeared, the live feeds of 10 different news organizations, the FBI's regional field office, and the State Bar Association's ethics committee. In the corner of the screen, the view count for the live stream Clara had initiated was climbing into the tens of thousands. "This isn't a mediation, Julian," I said, as the first images of the Project Phoenix ledgers began to scroll across the screen for the world to see. "This is an evidentiary hearing, and the whole world is the jury." Cal Whitaker turned to run, but the doors at the back of the courtroom were kicked open. The heavy thud of tactical boots filled the air as a federal recovery team, led by agents who didn't report to the local Norfolk precinct, flooded the room. "Arthur Sterling," Eleanor whispered, looking up at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You really are a fool. You think the truth matters? You've just destroyed everything. The Sterling name is dead." "The Sterling name died the night you married me, Eleanor," I said, picking up the wooden gavel. "I'm just here to pronounce the time of death." I brought the gavel down on the sound block. The sharp times, crack times echoed through the chamber, a final, definitive period at the end of a 40-year sentence. As the agents moved in to zip-tie Julian and Whitaker, I looked at Eleanor. She didn't move. She just stared at me, the ghost of her father's revenge finally catching up to her in the one place she thought she had conquered. I stood up, the black robe feeling heavier than it ever had, and walked down from the bench. The war wasn't over, but the lie was dead. And as I walked toward Clara, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a judge of the law. I was a witness to the truth. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the last truly familiar thing I would ever hear. It was a sharp, final crack that seemed to split the very air of the courtroom, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my shoes. For 40 years, that sound meant the conclusion of a dispute, the restoration of order, and the triumph of the law. But as I stood there, looking down at Eleanor and Julian in the flickering light of the projector screen, I realized that order had been a ghost I was chasing, while my own family burned the house down around me. The betrayal didn't feel like a sudden blow anymore. It felt like a slow, systemic poisoning that had finally reached my heart. My son was in handcuffs, his face twisted in a snarl of panicked entitlement, and my wife, the woman who had been the North Star of my existence, was looking at me with a cold, terrifying clarity that suggested she had been waiting for this moment since the day we met. I had built a life on the belief that the truth would set you free, but as the federal agents moved in, I realized the truth was a fire that consumed everything in its path, leaving only the charred remains of the man I used to be. The air in the courtroom was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust. Julian was struggling against the grip of 2 federal marshals, his expensive suit jacket torn at the shoulder. He was shouting about lawyers, about influence, about how I would regret this, but his voice sounded thin and brittle against the heavy silence of the chamber. Cal Whitaker had stopped fighting. He sat on the front bench, his head in his hands, the weight of a ruined empire finally bowing his shoulders. But Eleanor remained standing. She didn't move, didn't struggle, and didn't look away from me. Her emerald silk dress shimmered like a snake's skin under the fluorescent lights, and her composure was so absolute it was unnerving. "You think you've won, Arthur?" she asked, her voice calm and terrifyingly soft. It wasn't the voice of the woman who had kissed me goodbye every morning. It was the voice of a stranger who had been living in my house for 4 decades. "There is no winning tonight, Eleanor," I replied, stepping down from the bench, my black robe rustling like dry leaves. "There is only the end of the lie. Project Phoenix is over. The ledgers are public. The sterling name is finished." "The sterling name was finished the moment you took it," she spat, her eyes flashing with a sudden, violent heat. "You talk about justice as if it were a god you serve. But you're just a man with a badge and a massive, staggering ego. You never saw me, Arthur. Not once. You saw a beautiful companion, a supportive wife, a trophy to polish your reputation. You were so enamored with your own reflection in my eyes that you never bothered to look at who I actually was." "I loved you, Eleanor," I said, and the words felt like ash in my mouth. "You loved a ghost," she laughed, a short, jagged sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "Did you ever wonder why a woman like me, with my background, would fall for a rigid, self-righteous prosecutor like you? Did you think it was your charm? Your wit?" She stepped closer, ignoring the warning from the agent behind her. "My father was Victor Vance. Do you even remember his face, Arthur? Or was he just another case number on your way to the Supreme Court?" I froze. The name Vance had haunted the files Clara and I found, but hearing her claim it, hearing her weave it into our marriage, was a physical blow. Victor Vance was a criminal. He embezzled millions from pension funds. He destroyed thousands of lives. He was a man who was broken by a system that needed a scapegoat, and you were the one who swung the axe, Eleanor hissed, her face inches from mine. "I was 22 years old when I sat in that gallery and watched you read his sentence with that same smug, holy expression you're wearing right now. He died in a prison infirmary 6 months later, alone and disgraced. I didn't marry you for the sterling money, Arthur. I married you because I wanted to be there when you realized that your precious law is just a tool for whoever is strong enough to wield it. I wanted to turn your life into a monument to the very corruption you claim to fight. Every signature you gave me, every seal you let me use, it was a tribute to my father." The depth of her hatred was a chasm I couldn't even see the bottom of. She had spent 40 years, 14,000 nights sleeping beside the man she blamed for her father's death, just to ensure his ultimate downfall. It wasn't just greed. It was a generational blood feud, a slow-motion assassination of my entire moral world. "Mom, shut up," Julian yelled, his face pale. "Don't say anything else." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She turned her gaze to Julian, then back to me. "I raised him to be everything you aren't, Arthur. I raised him to be a predator because I knew that one day he would be the one to pull the trigger on your legacy. And he did it beautifully, didn't he? He sold your integrity for pennies on the dollar, and you never even noticed." Suddenly, the tension in the room snapped. Cal Whitaker, who had been sitting silently, lunged toward the evidence table, where Clara's laptop was still streaming. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to destroy the digital tether that was broadcasting their sins to the world. One of the marshals moved to intercept him, and in the chaos, Julian broke free from his captors. He didn't run for the door. He ran for the marshal's sidearm. "No!" I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening roar of a gunshot. The bullet shattered the glass of the witness stand, raining shards down like diamonds. Another shot rang out, then a third. The courtroom, a place of orderly debate, was suddenly transformed into a kill zone. I felt a sharp, searing heat graze my arm as I dove for the floor, pulling Clara down with me. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of people who realized that the law could no longer protect them. I looked up through the smoke. Julian was standing near the jury box, the gun heavy in his hand, his eyes wild with a frantic, cornered madness. He pointed the weapon toward the bench toward me. "You should have stayed dead, Dad," he shrieked. "You should have just burned in the house." He leveled the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. I saw his mother standing behind him, her face a mask of cold, expectant triumph. She was finally going to see her father's judge executed by his own son. But the shot never came. The heavy bronze doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and a second wave of tactical responders, the local police who had finally realized the feds were in their building, flooded in. "Drop the weapon," they roared. Julian wavered, his eyes darting between the marshals and the new arrivals. In that moment of hesitation, the federal agent behind Eleanor moved. He didn't fire. He tackled Julian from behind, the two men crashing into the wooden railing with a sickening thud. The gun skittered across the floor, spinning until it came to rest at my feet. I looked at the weapon, then at my son, who was being pinned to the ground, his face pressed against the carpet he had walked on so proudly just minutes ago. I looked at Eleanor, who was finally being forced into the zip ties she had earned 40 years ago. Her composure was gone now, replaced by a raw, naked fury, as she realized the phoenix had failed to rise. I stood up slowly, my arm throbbing where the bullet had grazed the skin. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I didn't feel the satisfaction of a case closed. I just felt an overwhelming, soul-crushing exhaustion. I looked around the ruined courtroom, the shattered glass, the overturned chairs, the blood on the floor. This was the Sterling legacy. This was the result of a 40-year war I hadn't even known I was fighting. Clara stood up beside me, her hand trembling as she gripped my arm. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. "We have it all." Every word she said was recorded. I looked at my daughter, the only person left who truly knew my name. "It's over," I repeated, but the words felt like a question. As the officers led them away, Eleanor stopped for a brief second. She looked at me, her silver hair disheveled, her emerald dress stained with the dust of the floor. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes told me everything. She had lost the war, but she had achieved her goal. She had broken me. She had taken the great Judge Sterling and turned him into a man who had to watch his own family led away in chains. I watched the doors close behind them, leaving the courtroom in a sudden, ringing silence. The projector screen was still glowing, the view count still climbing, but I couldn't look at it anymore. I walked toward the exit, my steps heavy and uncertain. The law had been upheld. The truth had been revealed. But as I stepped out into the cold Virginia night, I realized that some verdicts carry a price that no man can truly afford to pay. The morning light that follows a storm has a way of being cruel in its clarity. It doesn't just show you what survived. It forces you to look at every splintered piece of what was lost. Standing on the worn wooden planks of the Norfolk Pier, I watched the sun creep over the Atlantic, painting the water in shades of bruised gold and gray. The air was frigid, tasting of salt and the metallic tang of a winter that refused to end. A month had passed since that night in the courtroom, since the sharp crack of my gavel signaled the end of a 40-year lie and the beginning of a silence I never knew existed. My home was a charred skeleton. My wife and son were names on a federal indictment, and the sterling legacy, the one I had spent my entire life polishing like a family heirloom, had been revealed as a hollow vessel for someone else's revenge. I looked down at my hands, the hands of a man who was supposed to be a ghost, and realized that for the first time in my 68 years, they weren't holding a pen, a seal, or a gavel. They were empty. And in that emptiness, there was a strange, terrifying peace. I had spent so long judging others, measuring their truth against the rigid yardstick of the law, that I had forgotten how to look at my own life without a mask. Now, with the masks burned away and the truth laid bare, I was finally beginning to understand that the only verdict that truly matters is the one you can live with when the world stops watching. The aftermath was a slow, bureaucratic grinding of the gears of justice. Eleanor and Julian were held without bail, their assets frozen, their web of influence systematically dismantled by a federal task force that didn't care about the sterling name. The news cycles were relentless. They called it the judicial scandal of the century, a headline that I had to read every morning over a lukewarm cup of coffee in Clara's kitchen. My face was on every screen, sometimes portrayed as a hero who had come back from the dead, but more often as a useful fool who had allowed a criminal empire to grow under his own roof. I didn't fight the narrative. I didn't call the reporters or release statements. I sat in Clara's garden, digging my fingers into the cold Virginia soil, helping her plant winter kale and listening to the wind in the oaks. I had spent 40 years speaking for the law, and I found that I no longer had anything to say to the world. One afternoon, a package arrived from the federal prosecutor's office. It was a box of personal items recovered from the estate after the fire marshal had cleared the site. Among the soot-stained silverware and charred frames was a small, blackened jewelry box. Inside, miraculously untouched by the heat, was the simple gold band I had placed on Eleanor's finger 40 years ago. I sat with it in my palm for hours, watching the light catch the inscription inside, "Always yours." It was a relic of a marriage that never truly existed, a symbol of a devotion that had been weaponized against me. I realized then that Eleanor's greatest victory wasn't the money or the Phoenix Project. It was the fact that she had made me love a woman who was a ghost. She had turned my capacity for trust into my greatest weakness. But as I looked at the ring, I didn't feel the urge to throw it or scream. I felt a quiet, heavy pity for the girl who had sat in my courtroom 40 years ago, so consumed by her father's shadow that she had built a 40-year prison for herself just to see me suffer. "Are you okay, Dad?" Clara asked, stepping onto the porch with 2 mugs of tea. She sat beside me, her presence a steady, unwavering anchor in the debris of my life. "I was just thinking about the house," I said softly, closing the box. "About all the things we thought were permanent. The marble, the mahogany, the reputation. It all went up in minutes." "Maybe it needed to," Clara replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You were living in a museum, Dad. You were so busy protecting the statues that you didn't notice the foundation was rotting. At least now we're standing on solid ground." She was right. The sterling legacy wasn't in the bricks of that Richmond estate or the high-backed chair in the courthouse. It was in the woman sitting beside me, the one I had almost lost because I was too blinded by a beautiful lie. We spent the rest of the day talking, really talking about Thomas, about her childhood, about the years of silence that we had finally broken. There were no secrets anymore, no judicial distance. We were just a father and a daughter, 2 people who had survived a war and were trying to figure out how to be a family again. A few days later, I drove down to Norfolk. I parked the rusted Ford near the docks, the same docks where Project Phoenix had once moved its cargo of misery. The warehouses were quiet now, cordoned off with yellow tape, guarded by federal marshals who didn't recognize the old man in the baseball cap. I walked to the very end of the pier, where the land gave way to the endless, churning Atlantic. The wind was fierce, tugging at my coat, whistling through the gaps in the wood. I stood there for a long time, watching the gulls swoop and dive, their cries sounding like echoes of the people I couldn't save. I realized that for 40 years I had chased a version of justice that was cold and clinical. I had believed that if the paperwork was correct and the signatures were in place, the world was right. I had been a man of the law, but I hadn't been a man of the truth. Eleanor had used that against me. She had used my obsession with the form of justice to hide her destruction of its substance. But standing there, with the spray of the ocean on my face, I realized that I hadn't just lost a life. I had gained a soul. I no longer needed the black robe to tell me who I was. I was Arthur Sterling, a man who had been a fool, a man who had been betrayed, but a man who had finally chosen to open his eyes. I took the gold ring from my pocket and looked at it one last time. It didn't represent love anymore, only a debt that had been paid in full. I tossed it into the water. It made a small, insignificant splash before being swallowed by the gray depths. The ocean didn't care about the Vances or the Sterlings. It didn't care about revenge or legacies. It just kept moving, indifferent and eternal. I turned back toward the shore, toward the rusted truck, and the long drive back to Clara's house. I was 68 years old, my home was gone, and my name was tarnished beyond repair. But as I walked, my steps felt lighter than they had in decades. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was just a man going home to his daughter. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing Eleanor in a cell. It was finding the peace she tried so hard to steal. The dawn was finally here, and for the first time in 40 years, I was ready to meet it. If the story of Arthur Sterling's journey to reclaim justice has touched your heart, please leave a comment to share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to watch the next series. You can also watch more of the thrilling stories currently displayed on the screen. Looking at the image of Arthur standing alone before the sea, I suddenly realized that money or fame will eventually fade like the smoke in that study long ago. The only thing that remains is the serenity when we dare to face the truth, no matter how painful that truth may be. I hope we always have enough courage to protect what is right, just as Arthur did to protect his own honor. Goodbye for now, and see you again.